Henry I didn't have the easiest path to power. There are some question marks over how he did, in fact, succeed as king. In 1087, his father, William the Conqueror, died. Henry's oldest brother, Robert, was made Duke of Normandy, and his other surviving brother, William, became King of England. Henry inherited financially from his father, but he gained very little land. William the Conqueror had one other son called Richard, but he died young. William II is regarded as one of the weakest kings of England, but his reputation has largely been sullied by his poor relationship with the clergy. The clergy were the people who chronicled the events at the time, and so if you had a poor relationship with them, then you'd very often come out with a blackened reputation. A couple of things that were thrown at William II were that he might be an atheist, although I don't think that's true, and that he was gay because he didn't get married. Now, obviously, nowadays we know that's nothing to be ashamed of, but back then that would have been quite a serious accusation against him. And so there was a clear attempt to sully William II's name by the clergy, even though although they were men of religion, they're about as narrow-minded as you're going to get. But William II actually, in my opinion, wasn't that bad a king. There are examples of him actually being quite a sound soldier, and he was very capable militarily. And actually his reign wasn't particularly unstable, certainly not in comparison to reigns that had gone earlier and reigns that were to come. But ultimately his reputation has definitely been tarnished, and he is considered a poor king, whether that's justified or not. The most important event that happened during William II's reign came in 1095, when Pope Urban II whipped up crusading fever across Europe and what would become known as the First Crusade. The Christian West had answered the call from the Eastern Roman Emperor Alexius I Komnenos for aid against the invading Turks. Alexius, though, soon came to regret that, as he was overwhelmed by the numbers of respondents that came flooding into the Byzantine Empire, and he was very soon trying to get rid of them. Duke Robert of Normandy, the brother of William II and the young Henry, was one of those men that answered the call, and he would become one of the leaders of the crusade. However, crusading was not a cheap venture, and in order to help finance his expedition, Robert would essentially hand over control of Normandy to King William in exchange for payment. He would never have full control over his duchy again. Whilst Robert was away, the political situation changed dramatically in the West. In early August of 1100, William was out hunting in the New Forest. Hunting was a favourite pastime of the nobility and kings and queens, and William was no different in that regard. But this outing would prove to be fatal. A man by the name of Walter Tyrrell was taking aim at what was supposed to be a stag. He pulled back his bow and fired. Smack! Right into the heart of King William II. William lay prostrate on the ground and lingered for a time before eventually expiring. There is to this day a plaque marking the spot in the New Forest where William died, and it's certainly my intention to go there and visit it one day. And to be honest, I should have visited it by now anyway. But yes, so if you're in that part of the world at any point, I recommend you go and see it. Was this murder? I think it's quite probable, yes. Tyrrell, if he had indeed spotted a stag, must too have seen the king in his line of vision. William II was not a man that was hard to miss. He was a large man like his father. and so he must have been quite easy to spot even in a forest. And the accuracy of Walter Tyrrell's shot seems to have been a little bit too accurate. It penetrated right through William II's heart, basically almost instantly killing him, and certainly not a blow he would have survived, even if he didn't die straight away. This ultimately is evidence that's based on circumstances, but the most damning of all the circumstantial evidence is the fact that in the forest at that particular time was the brother of William II, Henry. Henry didn't bother, for too long anyway, to pretend to mourn the king, and he departed immediately from the New Forest. 3 days after the death of William II, on the 5th of August, 1100, Henry I was crowned King of England. He had gone from being the landless and effectively powerless youngest son of William the Conqueror to now King of England, and would go on to become one of the most capable of all early medieval monarchs. The laws Henry established are referenced by Magna Carta. The nobles of the early 13th century sought to make the hopeless and hapless King John restore the country to the justice and good laws of the reign of Henry I. So even 80 years after Henry I had died, the laws that he had practiced and introduced and established were still being referenced as the standard to expect from monarchy. So this shows you how brilliantly capable in law Henry I was. But he wasn't without his flaws, however. With his first wife, he did produce a son and heir, William the Atheling, as well as his daughter, Matilda. But what Henry didn't do was produce male spares. What that means is that although he had an heir, in early medieval England, death was quite commonplace, especially with infants and young children. So William could potentially have expired at any moment, particularly growing up. So in an ideal world, a king doesn't just produce one male heir to his throne, he produces potentially 3 or 4, like William the Conqueror had done. William had 4 sons. One of them died, Richard, but he had the other 3 to pass on his inheritances to. So what that is a prime example is Henry should have paid attention to that and produced more legitimate male heirs. I say legitimate because Henry I was very fond of the women, and he had a lot of mistresses. Now, having a mistress was quite common amongst medieval kings, but Henry I took it to another level. He had at least 20 illegitimate children. And I actually saw the other day a historian say that it's now believed he had 24 illegitimate children, at a minimum. So that is quite extraordinary. If Henry had devoted some of his time to actually perhaps trying to produce more sons with his wife, Matilda of Scotland, then the chaos that would follow his reign may well have been avoided. Now, it's quite possible he did try and produce more sons with Matilda. I'm sure he did. But the fact that he had so many illegitimate children shows you that he spent a good deal of time away from Matilda. So, when the disaster of 1120 struck, Henry I had given himself a major problem. The first significant problem that Henry I faced, however, came 2 years before, in 1118 when Matilda of Scotland died. That might not have been considered too pressing an issue because Henry did have his heir, William, but in 1120 the sinking of the White Ship happened and threw Henry's plans into turmoil. The royal court had been in Normandy and was about to set sail and return to England. Henry I was on one ship, and an extremely lively party containing William was on another. The king set sail first, while William and his crowd got rapidly more and more drunk. A count by the name of Stephen, perhaps fearing what was to come, conveniently made an excuse of an upset stomach and so disembarked from the ship. This proved both a wise and fateful decision, as Stephen would go on to become king in 1135, usurping the throne from Henry I's daughter Matilda. If he hadn't had that bout of so-called illness, the anarchy of his reign would have been avoided, and perhaps Matilda would have succeeded Henry I. Anyway, the drunken crew on the White Ship now had the novel idea of trying to overtake the ship carrying the king, whilst they were completely intoxicated. This spelled complete and utter disaster. Almost immediately after departing the harbour at Barfleur, the White Ship ran into some rocks. The drunken revelry soon turned into fear and panic as the ship began to sink, and with it a generation of the English nobility. William the Atheling could have saved himself, and he in fact was put into a lifeboat, but in most noble fashion he turned back to try and save his drowning half-sister Matilda. This is not the same Matilda as the Empress Matilda, who was in fact his full sister. This is one of Henry I's illegitimate daughters. Others attempted to reach the lifeboat too, quite understandably, and it soon overturned. William, along with almost everybody else on the White Ship, apart from one or two survivors, died. Back in England, Henry I was unaware of the dynastic disaster that had unfolded off the coast of Normandy. When the news had started to filter back to the nobility, no one could bring themselves to inform the king. So, in what can be regarded as possibly one of the most cowardly acts in medieval history, to the point where it's quite funny, grown men refused to tell the king themselves, so instead they got a young boy to tell the king on their behalf. After the young boy had been forced forward and told the king what had happened, Henry I was distraught. First of all, for his son, but also for the future of his kingdom and the plans that he had for his legacy. He had no legitimate male heir to succeed him. Whilst he recovered from the shock of this devastating loss, Henry would have to weigh up his options. He would now realise that he had to try and marry and produce at least another male heir if he could. So he married a young girl called Adeliza of Louvain. This marriage proved fruitless, however. After Henry's death in 1135, Adeliza married again and produced 7 children with a knight called William de Albany. So it's safe to assume that the fact that there was no heirs produced with Henry was certainly through no biological fault of her own. Henry was, by the time of his marriage to Adeliza, well into his 50s and paying the price for his indulgent behaviour in his younger years. This ultimately left him with 2 options now. He pondered making one of his illegitimate sons his heir, or making his daughter his successor. He opted for Matilda, with her now back in the country after the death of her first husband, Henry V. the Holy Roman Emperor. Henry I must have known that this was far from ideal, only to support a woman. A woman ruler was not the ideal. In times of trouble, it was considered essential for a monarch to be capable of riding into battle. This was not expected of a woman, and Matilda's succession was always going to be disputed. As I mentioned, Matilda's first marriage was to the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry V. Henry V died in 1125. Matilda had made a good impression while she was in Germany, and when she returned, I think it's safe to say she probably did come back with a slight ego and a slight majesty about her, but I don't think you can blame her for that. What she certainly did do was keep the title of Empress, which she continued to use throughout her life. Her second marriage was to a man called Geoffrey of Anjou. The pair didn't particularly like each other, but they did the duty expected of them, and they produced children, including the future Henry II. The young Henry did in fact meet his grandfather whilst he was about 1 or 2. Henry I is said to have been extremely fond of his grandson, and was particularly delighted when he was in his presence. Perhaps in the young Henry, the old king saw a potential long-term solution to the dynastic problems that he, by the time of Henry's birth in 1133, must now have seen as inevitable. Henry I died in 1135. Having started out with nothing, he had gained everything. From the mysterious death of William II, Henry had acted swiftly and ruthlessly and claimed the crown of England. On Robert's return from crusade, Henry had fought off his oldest brother's attempts to reclaim the Duchy of Normandy. At Tenchebray, in 1106, Henry met Robert in battle and decisively defeated him. Robert would live out the rest of his long life as the captive of Henry, and would in fact only die a year before the king himself. Robert was about 80 when he died, in 1134, but as he sat in captivity, he must have pondered the life that he had lived. Was going on crusade worth the price of losing Normandy and spending 28 years in prison? I think he probably would have considered it, yes. The first crusade had been a spectacular success for Western Christendom. They had reclaimed Jerusalem, and Robert had been a part of that. The fact that he had lost control of Normandy, I think, would have been compensated by the fact that he now, as an old man, he would have been sure that he was going to receive rewards in the next life, or that's how he would have seen it. So, although he had a limited last third of his life, Robert of Normandy is a quite extraordinary man himself, and lived an extraordinary life, and plays a big part in the story of Henry I's reign, and in the reigns of the Norman kings in general. But back to Henry I. For all his brilliance in law and kingship, his legacy is tarnished by what was to come after his death. When Stephen usurped the throne from Matilda, it was an act of pure opportunism. Although Henry I had made the nobles swear 3 times, including on Henry's deathbed, to support Matilda's claim, Stephen and Henry would have known that they would not have accepted it, or a large portion of the nobility wouldn't have accepted it, and so it proved. The accusations of loftiness and a sense of superiority aimed at Matilda were just excuses for the fact that certain members of the nobility just did not want a woman as monarch. And so Stephen proved to be quite a calculating figure, I think. How he weighed up the situation on the white ship sinking and realised that he was in trouble. And a bit like that, 15 years later, he weighed up the situation and saw an opportunity to have himself crowned king. He was, after all, a grandson of William the Conqueror, so he did have noble blood. He was the son of a daughter of William the First. And he also had family members who were also on the First Crusade as well. So he must have thought that he had a pedigree required to be king, but that proved to be completely false. He was next to useless as a king. He was a kind-hearted man, actually, quite a lot less ruthless than other kings, but that isn't what was required of a king in the 12th century. And 18 years of civil war is not a good legacy for him to have left, but ultimately we'll talk about that a little bit later and a little bit more detail. As for Henry, as he lay dying, he would have contemplated his own life and the legacy that he had left. He would have wondered what was to come after his own expiration. And ultimately, he would have wondered how Matilda would have handled the situation. Whether he thought she was truly capable of hanging onto power, I'm sure he probably had his doubts. Ultimately, his legacy has kind of been lost a little bit by what happened after he died, but that shouldn't take away from the fact that he was an extremely good king. It's just a shame that he couldn't have just done one or two things more that thought about the future a little bit more, and then he would have been considered probably one of the greatest kings England's ever had. As it is, he's rather been forgotten about.